Public opinion in the political process, polling preferences, and as early as 1883 in American history, pollsters and the public have tried to predict election outcomes. They've tried to predict most notably presidential outcomes. And so they used to use straw polls, surveys, methods that tended to be unreliable and overrepresented upper middle class Americans, ignoring lots of other sections of society. But it speaks to the larger purpose of polling. Polling is important because it provides some input for people into the policy-making process. Politicians want to know what people think so that in theory they can create policies that respond to the wants and desires of the people. It provides an outlet for ideas in times other than election years. Gallup polling is consistently busy almost every day of the year, and it's not always during presidential election years. They are gauging public opinion along with other polling agencies constantly. But public opinion polls do help us interpret the meaning of elections. What does that mean? Well, public opinion polls can show that the candidates that tend to be responsive to the issues that are consistently found in public opinion polls throughout, let's say, the 2 years prior to a presidential election, that in that particular issue, whatever it may be, was important enough to people that it perhaps shifted their votes, particularly the votes of the 30% of people that make up what we call. So public opinion polls also affect elections because public opinion on the issues help translate the meaning of an election. Politicians who want to be elected or re-elected are going to be responsive to public opinion polls. They're going to be responsive to what they believe the voters want. And that tends to be staying away from extremist positions. As we looked at the graph of political ideology and we saw the box in the center of that graph, we talked about how most Americans tend to be political moderates. And so in theory, public opinion polls allow the political process to be more responsive to voters. And elections tend to be between two political moderates rather than between two candidates that are at opposite ends of the political spectrum. Scientific polling emerges in the 1920s and 30s as a result of the work of a guy named George Gallup, who wrote his dissertation about representative sampling for the University of Iowa. He initially looked at how newspapers could more accurately predict their readership, but he moves on after the 1936 presidential election to working with public opinion polls and political predictions. So components that have to be evident in scientific polling include random sampling. There is the possibility that a pollster could do a stratified sample, which is when they're trying to focus on a narrow segment of the population. They use U.S. Census data to select people that meet the criteria for the demographic they're looking for. So if they're looking for married couples in their 30s, they would use demographic data to only select married couples in their 30s. But random sampling is by far the most representative, and it is stratified across the entire population. So there's not a specific group that are targeted. The questions must be comprehensible. That means that they have to be understandable. They have to be vocabulary that's not so large that an average person that would answer a telephone or would take a survey in the mail could be able to understand them. And right now, it's estimated the average literacy rate or literacy level in the United States is about 8th grade. So they would need to be comprehensible without being too technical in their terms. Questions have to be asked fairly, and so that means researchers must consider the language they use, the phrasing they use, the tone in which, if it's a verbal poll, they ask the question so as not to bias or skew the results. And then the categories of responses have to be carefully considered. If pollsters ask yes or no questions, that does not tell them a great deal about public opinion. And so it's important that these categories and the responses that people have to offer that can be uniform but also a little more in depth in order to provide more information. And scientific polling has to account for sampling error. Sampling error, when it's smaller, means that the poll is generally a more representative poll, and when it is much larger, means that it's either sort of very, very skewed or sort of targeting one specific or demographic. So analyzing the polls for accuracy, that's the most important question to ask is, how was the poll conducted? Were they self-selected volunteers, such as internet polls when you're reading CNN and they have a poll that they want you to answer? Only people that read CNN primarily would have the opportunity to answer that particular poll, and only the people that feel strongly enough about that particular topic will actually take the poll. So that is not a representative sample. It's usually very emotionally charged people that participate on whatever the particular issue is. The most common form of poll method, despite cell phones, emails, internet technology that's developed, is still the telephone call. It's the most frequently used, and it tends to be the most representative just because of the varying degrees of population which can be addressed or contacted through telephone calls. And then you also, when you're looking at a poll, have to consider the sponsor of the study. So even if you are simply looking at the statistics, 60% of the people that took this poll believe this way. Who sponsored the study? The sponsor of the study will help you decide whether or not there might have been some biased questions. So if Corn Growers Association of America sponsors a poll about the dangers of high fructose corn syrup, is it good for you, is it not good for you, and they come back with poll results that say 80% of Americans surveyed said that high fructose corn syrup is just the same as sugar and it has the same health warnings / benefits. Okay, the sponsor of the study should clue you in that maybe there's some bias questions that were asked for that particular poll. Maybe not, but knowing who sponsored the study and what the results are can help you interpret these political polls more accurately. So as I mentioned earlier, the most scientific polls tend to be random sampled polls. Usually 1,000 to 1,500 people are sampled, and that provides generally a representative population of the United States. It's kind of shocking that such a small number can be representative, but it tends to work out that way. The idea is that each potential voter or adult has the same chance of being selected. And that's when pollsters are looking for very random, they're not targeting a specific group of people. And that's when random sampling is used. Stratified sampling is very, very difficult because it uses the U.S. Census data and it derives samples from the 4 geographic regions the United States is divided into, and pollsters only use stratified sampling when they're trying to address a specific group or groups of people. For example, people with master's degrees in their 40s. They would use a pollster, because a pollster was trying to contact people with those particular criteria, they would use stratified sampling. So generally speaking, sampling error becomes smaller when the greater number of people sampled, because sampling error and polls' scientific nature is directly linked to the size of the sample. Is it a large enough sample that it can be representative of whatever topic the researcher or the pollster is trying to address? And results of polls generally reflect how people will respond within a 95% degree of certainty, with plus or minus 3 percentage points. But polls generally tend to reflect how people would respond if they don't have any of the biases that we previously discussed. Okay, so this is an example of scientific polling. So there were over 1,000 people that were contacted. Only 843 said they were registered to vote, and the sample was collected from telephone exchanges or computer program that called 42,000 active residential phone numbers across the country. So this is believed to be a representative sample. If a poll is scientific and if it's been conducted properly, the theory is that 19 out of 20 times the results based on scientifically collected samples will differ by no more than 3 percentage points, plus or minus. That's considered to be a representative sample. Polling has become very, very popular. The proliferation or the spread of polling is linked to the ability of candidates and politicians to raise money to purchase polling services. Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, spent close to $1.9 million alone in 1993 after he was elected on polling in order to gauge public opinion about his first 100 days in office, which tend to be the most powerful or the most effective time in any president's office. Hundreds of polls are purchased and conducted in presidential campaigns in order to, or the hope is of the either incumbent or presidential hopeful, that they will gauge enough of what public opinion is, and they will be able to find that middle ground that is supported by their party base and also by the independent voters. There are also several criticisms of polling. The first is that people lie. Some people can identify themselves as likely or registered voters over the telephone, over the internet, in a survey, a mail-in survey. They may not have ever registered to vote in their life. They may never intend on voting, but because they want their opinion to be counted, they could lie. So you could have skewed political results, and polling results, and you don't know that because who knows whether or not these people are lying. Polls also show flat snapshots of opinions at that particular moment in time, but pollsters could call me and ask me a question if I'm having a bad day or I don't like the news. I could say one thing, and then when it comes time for me to vote in 3 months in a presidential election or congressional election, I could change my mind, go very different than what I said I would do or what I thought I would do 3 months ago when the poll was conducted. And people feel with polling when they're conducted and they get to participate, or they choose to participate rather than hanging up on the pollsters, that that is a way that they are expressing their views and really being heard by politicians. But the effectiveness and how much politicians really put into polls is very much up for. Other criticisms of polls include the wording, the phrasing, this particular vocabulary, the tone, the inflection, and the way that these questions are asked, particularly over the telephone, is very important in determining whether or not poll results are skewed or biased. There are also responses to very highly emotional issues are skewed depending upon the wording. So support for abortion rights can range anywhere from 40 to 90% depending on the question asked, how the question was asked, the phrasing of the question. So if someone calls and they say, "Do you support the murder of babies?" Most people are not going to say that they do. I said most. However, if you also have a poll that calls and the first question is, "Do you support a woman's right to make her own decisions about medical issues?" you're going to have very different results from those two polls that are essentially asking the same questions. That's why wording is so very important. Some other criticisms of polling include the exit poll, and that is when pollsters stand outside of a voting precinct and they ask people who they voted for after the fact. Some people say that this discourages voter turnout for either candidate in either direction, the one that's in the lead or the one that's behind, because people then think their voting doesn't matter. Polling also is said to create a bandwagon effect. Well, if everybody's voting for this candidate, he or she must be a great guy and I'll vote for them even though I have no idea what's going on. And polling also sometimes creates an underdog effect. Well, candidate A is 30 percentage points ahead of candidate B, so candidate B is clearly the underdog. Can they rally? Can they gain support and somehow win this election? Is government responsive to public opinion? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. Those who vote often have different opinions than those who do not vote, and elected officials tend to respond to voters. Public opinion, just because it's popular, does not always make it right. And one last thing that's worth noting is that government officials pay attention not only to the direction of public opinion, but to the intensity. When changes in public opinion are very clear-cut, government policy usually becomes very consistent with public opinion. So if people support raising minimum wage to $20 an hour, but they're not very passionate about raising minimum wage, they're not very intense about it, then the issue may